Great, well thanks for coming everybody. It's going to be a really exciting meeting. Just to start off with, just to say we swapped the order around a bit, so we're going to start off with Dr. Bruce Bloom, and then we're going to have Professor Michael Briggs, and then after that we're going to have Dr. Fareed Khan, who's just arrived down from Manchester. So this is very exciting, the whole issue of drug repositioning. It's something that's increasingly on the agenda, and what we hope to be able to show to you today is the potential that drug repositioning has, particularly for rare diseases, in kind of bringing new treatments to the clinic. My own personal journey started with alkaptonuria, which is the disease that affects my children, and for which there is a drug called nitisinone, which was originally a weed killer, and which got repositioned from weed killer to treatment for a rare disease called hereditary tyrosinemia type 1, because it works on the same metabolic pathway, and is now being repositioned from hereditary tyrosinemia type 1 to alkaptonuria. And there are even, I've heard, rumours that it's being repositioned for other rare diseases. And so really what this kind of shows is that when you have a drug that's been developed for one disease and you've developed kind of toxicology data and all kinds of safety data, etc., it then is potentially easier to start using it for other diseases. So what we're going to look at today is a series of kind of examples of this. We're going to start with Dr. Bruce Bloom, who's come over from the US. So Bruce is the President and Chief Science Officer of Cures Within Reach, which is, for me, one of the most pioneering medical outfits out there. And Bruce has been doing drug repositioning now for 13 years, so he really is one of the leaders in this field, if not the leader, in my opinion. And Bruce is going to be talking about kind of non-profit and social financing models for drug repositioning. In particular, he's going to be talking about the work that he's done at Cures Within Reach, all about taking generic drugs and then repositioning them for rare diseases with some real examples of fantastic success. So I'm going to hand over to Bruce, who's going to be speaking now and who's going to take questions.
So, I want to talk about the 6,000 of the 7,000 unsolved diseases out in the world that are rare diseases. And, they affect, rare diseases probably affect some 30 million people out in the world. It's a huge number of people. And, when you think about there's 7,000 total diseases and 6,000 rare diseases that are currently unsolved, and we rely on the pharmaceutical industry as our solution generator, and depending on what jurisdiction you're in, they create somewhere between 20 and 40 drugs a year that get approved. Some of those are just duplicates of other drugs, and so the net is maybe 20, 25 drugs a year. It's going to take a long time to get to 7,000 or 6,000 diseases, so we need some other strategies. One strategy that we have out in the world is clinicians are smart enough to do drug repurposing one patient at a time. Right? In the US, depending on which statistic you read, physicians prescribe between 16 and 23% of all prescriptions written are written off-label. In other words, written for a disease indication for which they're not currently approved. And in mental health and pediatrics, the numbers are well over 70%. And so physicians have known for a long time that drug repurposing is one of the only ways they're going to solve some of these unsolved diseases. Sometimes they do a good job, and sometimes they're palliative, and sometimes they don't work at all. So we talk about repurposing and think about it as the sort of the reuse of anything that's already approved for human use: drugs, devices, diagnostics, even nutraceuticals, botanical medicines, things you can buy at a health food store that have strong biological function. Even integrative medicine. We once funded a project that showed that if you could train patients with lung cancer in Qigong breathing so that they learned to hold their breath, then they could get a regular X-ray that was as diagnostic as a CT scan, saving a significant amount of money. And so any of those kinds of things that reduce costs and improve outcomes that are already available for human use are things that we at Cures Within Reach look at. We even have a division called Dogs for Cures, which trains diabetic alert dogs that help patients with type 1 diabetes know when their blood sugar is high or low much more quickly than the little device that's checking their blood. The dog's nose is way more sensitive, sometimes as much as 10 to 20 minutes earlier and patients that have a diabetic alert dog, their blood sugar, if this is the normal range for a healthy person, and this is the normal range for a diabetic, they're within 10% of the normal range for a healthy person, even though they have type 1 diabetes, where your average well-controlled diabetic is between 20 and 25%. And over a lifetime, this makes a huge difference in the outcome of diabetic neuropathies, diabetic cardiopathies, and other kinds of things. Now, when we first started this, we fell into drug repurposing totally by accident. We had funded about 200 projects as our nonprofit, and about 190 of those were de novo research, a new disease, a new drug, a new target, looking for a gene, and 10 of them, just by accident, happened to be repurposing. We were one of the first groups that repurposed the drug thalidomide for multiple myeloma in 1999, and it just happened that about 5 years ago we went and looked back at the work we'd done, and what we found was 0 of our 190 de novo projects were actually making a patient impact, but 4 of 10 repurposing projects were making a patient impact. And we suddenly went, what if we focused on that? Is there enough repurposing out there? Would people be interested in partnering with us? So we did a study, and we found that 2/3 of the researchers we talked to in academic research centers had an idea ready for research right now, and 1/4 of clinicians had something they were using in clinical practice that they would like to see scientifically validated. So we realized that there is a lot of this available out there, and there are people that were willing to work on it. So we shifted our focus away from general research to just repurposing. So why repurposing? There's a lot of good reasons that I put up on the board here. Many of you that are working in this area know these things, and there are even many more. But for us, it's faster, it's safer, it's more likely to succeed. The return on investment is great, and most importantly, it gets things to patients more quickly. And as a not-for-profit, one of our chief endpoints is a robust clinical trial that a physician could use with their patient to decide to use something off-label. Because the minute we publish something, physicians can start using it with their patients, at least in the US, and in many other countries it's allowed to prescribe off-label. Whether you get reimbursed for it, those kinds of things are secondary issues, but if it can make an impact, we're happy to have that happen. So what are the roadblocks to repurposing? Probably the biggest roadblock is that there's no natural economic incentive, especially for the repurposing of generic drugs that are widely available from multiple manufacturers. So if I today and I said, we have research that proves that aspirin would help lupus, that would be great for the lupus patients, right? But nobody's going to make money selling aspirin to lupus patients, right? Because you can go to Boots Chemist and buy aspirin of whatever brand you want for, maybe a penny a piece. And so who's going to fund that research except philanthropy? Because nobody can make a profit selling aspirin to lupus patients. It doesn't make a dent in anybody's bottom line. So sometimes the science is strong, but there's very weak intellectual property protection, sometimes none. Often you can get a method of use patent around a new use, but if the physician can prescribe it off-label and the patient can get it at the pharmacy from any manufacturer they want, you owning that method of use patent isn't very strong. Sometimes it's hard to find patients for this kind of research, right? So especially in rare disease, for those of you that know the AKU Society, one of the main things that they've been able to accomplish is gathering where the patients are around the world and getting people enrolled in a clinical trial. It's often very challenging when you're doing drug repurposing to find patients who can participate. The other thing is it's a global issue, but often there's a local solution. There'll be one scientist at one university who's interested in this, who has access to a couple of patients, and yet these patients exist around the world, like at the AKU Society. There's 13 countries that are participating in that research. Organizing that is a challenge in and of itself, on top of all the other lack of economic incentives to do this. So sometimes it's very hard to do this kind of work, and so we need to think about what kind of innovative partnerships we can put together to make this happen. And so I want to talk about a number of different things today with you. I'll focus on 3 different things. One is these innovative partnerships, and we'll talk about what these look like. The second one is a model for creating a new economic system around the repurposing of generic drugs for rare diseases and also for common diseases. And then a new web platform that we're building to try and provide the opportunity for all of this to work together at the same time. So there's a couple of examples that I want to give here around innovative partnerships. And almost in every one of these cases, this has started with a disease-specific nonprofit that pushed this to happen. Again, much like what Nick and the AKU Society has been able to do with nitisinone, somebody needed to get this started, and you can't really expect an academic researcher to do this. You often can't expect a government to do this. Somebody needs to be out there to be the passionate advocate to bring everybody together and make this happen. And so the first example I want to show you is what's actually been branded as the Learning Collaborative. And it's a US-based group of organizations working together. The University of Kansas, which has a very strong translational medicine and drug repurposing center. The Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, which did the majority of the fundraising and had the patient access for the CLL disease that was being studied. And then the National Institutes of Health division called NCATS, the National Center for Advancing Translational Science. They have a division that does drug screening. They're probably one of the top 10 drug screening places in the world, and they have the biggest library of compounds that are active and approved for human use around the world. And so they undertook this drug repurposing screening, and what they came up with for CLL was a compound called Aranafin, which is a gold compound, and it's only manufactured by one company. It's used in a couple of other rare diseases. It's not a highly sought-after compound, but it actually looks like it works in chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which is a rare disease. About 15,000 people in the U.S. have that. So in the U.S., we consider rare disease anything where less than 200,000 people. So it's verging on ultra-rare at 15,000 people. Not attractive to industry in any way, because there's not that many patients. It's also one of those diseases that is sort of long, drawn-out, a quiescent period, during which time you mostly choose not to treat at all. And then it quickly shifts into an active phase, and you scramble to try and do something. The patients often go downhill very quickly. And so it's not the kind of disease that pharma would typically want to go after. And so they put this consortium together, and the good news is that they're in clinical trial. They're in the second year of a clinical trial testing this for CLL. The bad news is, in the middle of the clinical trial, the one company that manufactures this decided they were not going to manufacture it anymore. And so this cooperative is scrambling around to see if they can actually buy the rights to manufacture this the drug and the know-how to get it done. But it's a really interesting combination of government, nonprofit, and academia coming together to do this. And if it works, it would be a real boon to CLL patients around the world. Again, global issue, local solution. So, it would be really great if we were able to get all the CLL organizations around the world to support this, so that if we had more money and we had access to more patients, we had more clinical sites so we could accrue patients more quickly. But we haven't really developed that kind of a system yet, although there are actually a couple people in this room that are working on that right now, which is very exciting. The second initiative that is more global is an Alzheimer's initiative, which is a collaboration between the Alzheimer's Drug Rediscovery Foundation in the US and Alzheimer's Society UK to come together to look at drug repurposing. So this is a big step for both of these organizations that for years have been funding only de novo research and have realized with all the trials and tribulations we've had in many of the CNS diseases around de novo research, that maybe we should be spending part of our budget, not all of it, but a part of our budget on drug repurposing. And so they've started to fund projects up to $1.5 million, which is enough money to get you to maybe a small phase 2 clinical trial where you can actually see some proof of concept in patients. And the good news is there are plenty of patients out there. The bad news is we still don't have good biomarkers and other kinds of things to evaluate this. And so this group is also working around the edges of Alzheimer's disease, and there's a project here that we're actually involved in. It's Cures Within Reach. For many Alzheimer's patients, as they move through their journey, they reach a point at which they're still aware of what's going on, but they have lost so much of their cognitive ability that they become agitated, frustrated, angry, and this period can last from 6 weeks to 6 months, and it's very difficult for the patient and for their caregivers and family members. And so we're funding a repurposing project around a cannabinoid called nabilone, which is a derivative of marijuana, and it looks like in some anecdotal clinical discoveries that were not done with the packaged drug, but were tested in other ways in families that had their patient at home, that this does reduce the agitation significantly. It also increases appetite. It does some other things that helps these patients during this period of time. So, hopefully this will be the start of many things we can do to support Alzheimer's research. But it's interesting that this is a nice sort of global interaction. We're hoping to get more Alzheimer's not-for-profits from more countries to participate in this. What's really interesting is it's a UK organization and a US organization that's funding a project in Canada, which is great. And once we agreed to fund that project, the Canadian Alzheimer's Foundation agreed to participate. So now there's actually a third not-for-profit in here. So maybe we're learning to do this on a more global basis. I want to talk a little bit more about the work that Nick mentioned at the beginning. The AKU Society has really been instrumental in organizing around this nitisinone trial. And Nick's told me that the funding is now up around $13 million and 13 million pounds, which is even more significant. And what's really interesting is how this all started. So this actually started in the US at the NIH. A researcher in very rare diseases named Bill Gall, who Nick and I both know, just a sort of Sherlock Holmes of ultra rare diseases. And he realized, based on the action of this particular drug, that it might work in AKU. And they actually funded a clinical trial where it looked like, in certain levels, that this was totally working, except we didn't have good biomarker and good outcome measurements, and so the trial was too short and looking at the wrong endpoints, and so it looked like it had failed, when in fact it probably had succeeded very well. And once Nick found out about these data, he was able to begin to generate a lot of interest around doing the proper clinical trial to get the right answer for this particular disease. And even though this is it's a rare disease, how many patients are there in the UK? 64 patients known in the UK, and maybe around the world, 500 or 600. It's important, and this is one of those interesting diseases where, it's a lifelong journey for these patients. So this isn't the kind of disease where if you don't, nip it in the bud right now, the patients are going to die. These are patients that are going to, live and be very expensive and have more debilitating illness over a long lifetime. And so it's important to support these kinds of diseases early on and get them when the patients are, early diagnosed, so you can prevent most of the things. And what's also interesting about this, one of the characteristics of this particular disease is osteoarthritis, and that actually is part of what was the genesis for Nick and Tony to start Findacure, because if we find out that nitisinone works for the osteoarthritic part of AKU, there's a good chance it might work in osteoarthritis, at least in some parts of our osteoarthritis for patients who only have osteoarthritis. And so we learn a lot by doing repurposing in two ways. First, we learn a mechanism of action and a kind of drug that will work, and maybe then we can go out and create better drugs that work more quickly with less side effects. And we also learn about rare diseases and the kinds of treatments that work for them that can inform us about how we could use that knowledge to treat more common diseases that are much more expensive and affect many more patients. So this is a perfect example of where drug repurposing informs us about a lot for a much smaller amount of money and in a much shorter period of time than de novo research, and often with a much higher return on investment. In our portfolio of repurposing projects, we're right at 20% success rate. So, and that falls right in line with what you might expect from the kinds of repurposing that we do, because if you look at the pharmaceutical de novo pipeline, by the time things get to late phase 2 and into phase 3, somewhere between 10 and 30% of those projects actually get market approval and get to patients. Well, if you're repurposing a drug that's already been used in patients and where there's some degree of efficacy either through clinical use or good scientific data, you're sort of starting with a repurposed drug that's somewhere in that late phase 2, phase 3. It looks the same. And so you would expect to have that same level of outcome, and that's what we've seen in the work that we've done. And so when you think about that from a perspective of return on investment and a success ratio of 10 to 30% compared to, the pharmaceutical de novo pathway where, with starting compounds it's 1 in 10,000, and even with things that get into clinical trial it's 1 in 1,000, and it finally works its way down to, 1 in 10 to 3 in 10. So it's a very powerful potential model. Here's a recent project that we got that I think is very interesting in the way we're looking at funding it. So there's evidence in the literature that for women undergoing breast cancer surgery, that if they were given a particular nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drug just prior to their surgery, they have a much lower recurrence rate in their breast cancer. And the probability is that there is some kind of an inflammatory response to the surgery, which makes it more likely that cells metastasize from the surgical site and become implanted in other places where they eventually develop into recurrent breast cancer. And if you can tamp down that inflammatory response in and around the surgical time, you can remove that from happening. And so here's a very inexpensive way to cut recurrence of breast cancer risk. And there's a small clinical trial going on in Europe to test this. But we've been in discussions with the Nigerian government. Nigeria breast cancer is rampant, and the outcomes are much worse than in developed countries partly because they're diagnosed at a much later time, and also because they don't get the same kind of care that we do here. But the Nigerian government is actually considering funding the research themselves because of the expense that they have and such a high recurrence rate in breast cancer. And this is a work of a researcher in the US and a researcher in Italy working with Cures Within Reach and through the new Cure Accelerator. And so we're hoping this is another model where we can go to the places where these diseases are most rampant and see if we can find the money and the support to do these kinds of repurposing projects. Great. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the processes that we're using. So hacking medicine. So hacking medicine is when people get together in sort of in a group and try and work through a problem very quickly. And we're starting to use hacking medicine to look at repurposing opportunities. It looks like it could be a really a great thing to do this. And there's been some successes in hacking medicine where in a very short period of time, a wide variety of people have gotten together. Researchers, clinicians, funders, technologists, computational biologists, all sorts of people come together to do some kinds of things. And here's one that I just wanted to highlight, which is a do-it-yourself device that helps patients, that helps parents keep track of how their child's their blood glucose is doing when the child has diabetics. So it actually uses distance and Wi-Fi to help the parents keep track of what's going on with the kids, because you know you can't trust a 10-year-old to keep track of their own blood sugar, but if the parent knows, even when the kid's playing baseball or riding their bike, you can help keep their their blood sugar in a much narrower range. And this came totally out of a hackathon where parents were complaining about this, and so literally within 9 months of the day of the hackathon, these kinds of self-made devices were available, and parents are now starting to use these with their kids to see what's going on with their glucose monitor when the parent is at a different location. So a very cool thing that we're going to start to put into use in drug repurposing. I also want to talk a little bit about computational biology. I know there's at least a couple of people in this room that are working on this, taking huge databases of knowledge that we've gathered over the years and figuring out how it can inform us about what might be the right kinds of repurposing to do to really even shorten an already shortened timeline to get things to patients. So there's all sorts of things out in the literature that are widely and publicly available, really smart people have figured out how to create algorithms and do some computational biology to tease out and merge these things, so you begin to get a set of potential already approved drugs that might work in ways you would never have expected. Now, some of this is already in the literature. If you dive in, you can find some of these obvious repurposing things. But the cool thing about computational biology is how it's finding non-obvious connecting the dots around this. And then for us to validate and verify and move those to clinical trials is much more of a possibility. So there's over 1 trillion data points, and it's growing all the time. There's a lot of articles on computational medicine. It's become a huge thing out in the world, and right now there's at least 120 companies that come up in my search. My guess is, since I did this in October, there's probably now 200 companies, because it's a real area where things are starting. And here's just a couple of places where this is actually working. So BioVista is one of these companies, and they've come up with at least 2 rare disease compounds that are in clinical trials right now, and they're doing some work for some of the corporations. And a group that I know at the University of Pittsburgh found a drug for a rare deficiency that's also in clinical trials right now. I want to switch gears for a second and talk about how you create economic incentives around this. So Nick and I and several others have been working here in England about generating a social impact bond to pay for repurposing trials in rare diseases using generic drugs. So getting a return from the success payer, which in this case would be the English government, and for every $1 we could save them by getting a cheap repurposed therapy out there, they would give us a portion of that to pay back for-profit investors that would help us to fund these kinds of research projects. There's a number of different ways you can do this. The one we're talking about is at the top of this list, a social impact bond, where basically the investors own the bond, and in the end, if we're able to create these kinds of repurposed therapies and they do lower costs, the government will pay us a portion of that savings, and we'll use that to pay back those bondholders. So, oftentimes the government is unwilling or unable to do this kind of work, and pharmaceutical companies aren't focused on these kinds of rare diseases, and so somebody else has to step in. You can do this sometimes philanthropically, as Nick has done with AKU, and then get the governments to kick in, but we've got to find a system where we can do more of this if we're going to get to more of those 6,000 drugs. So this all started about 5 years ago, right here in the UK, with a gent that you may all know, Sir Ronald Cohen, who was a financier and put together this group that's now part of the G8, looking at social finance for investments. And we're hoping that, to kick off within the next 12 months, we're hoping next year on Rare Disease Day that we'll be able to report that we have the first funded social impact bond for rare disease. And our hope is to attract government funding in a way that doesn't put the government at risk unless we're successful. So only in the event that we create these things are we able then to get our money back. And the investors will be at risk, but there's huge potential for return on this. And in the U.S., it's a little more difficult because there are over 400 healthcare payers, where here there's only one. So it's much easier to start here. But we're looking at other single government payer systems like Canada and Israel, and we're hoping to eventually have a consortium of governments that are willing to do this. So this is what a social impact bond looks like. So the investors give money to a group like ours. We fund and manage these repurposing trials that lower the costs. Those lower cost savings go into the government's pocket, and the government pays us back a certain amount of that, and then we pay the investors back. And we hope that there's enough left over that we can start this process all over again. And so really the only group that's at risk in this is the investors, but the opportunity for payback is huge. And here's an example in a rare disease. So this is a disease, there's about 600 kids in the US that have this disease. And it typically costs about $100,000 per patient per year because they're hospitalized so often. We spent less than $300,000 in 3 years to fund first an animal model and then a clinical trial. And now these kids are well controlled on a drug that costs them less than $5,000 a year. So we've gone from $100,000 to $5,000, saving about $95,000 per patient per year for 600 patients is almost $60 million on a $250,000 investment. And if the government was actually willing to give us 50% of that back for 5 years, that'd be a nice return for those investors. Now, every project's not going to look like this, and the portfolio, they're not all going to happen, but it's still enough to, theoretically get a nice return and have a huge medical and social impact. Here's another one. So this disease, familial dysautonomia, averaging $60,000 a year in cost savings for a rare disease versus, here's a drug that was created by a pharmaceutical company that costs $300,000 a year. Both of them are providing really good outcomes for the patients, but this costs the government a lot, this saves the government a lot, and this happened in less than 5 years. This took 13 years and about $2 billion to create. And so, we can't solve every one like this, but there are plenty of those diseases out there that we can solve. And I know you can't really see this, but depending on the percent of success rate, the number of patients who have the disease, and how many of them actually use the treatment, you can get a huge return on your investment in a portfolio if even only 10% of the projects are successful. And we think if we're smart, we can do a lot better than 10%. Also, it's easy to track these things because we have codes in place to keep track of the diseases and the drugs and the treatments. Now, there are some changes that would be required for us to do this, but they're all doable. And some of them are much less difficult than a lot of the other regulatory things that happen out in the world. And so, as we said, we've been working with the British government and some others. We have a feasibility study, and Nick and I had a really great meeting on yesterday where one of the groups that does social finance bonds here. Are you giving me that 1 minute? Okay. So the last thing I wanted to say as I wrap up is that we are creating a website, a web platform called Cure Accelerator, which is going to allow us to do all the things that I just talked about, from creating relationships to having virtual hacks through the discussion forums to allowing computational medicine people to put up opportunities for rare disease organizations to work with, and to even do social medicine, so that if we do this, all the projects would come in through Cure Accelerator, would be validated through Cure Accelerator, and be managed through Cure Accelerator, so that where we're starting to get here, where people are working together, what's possible is to really have them all working at the same place and doing the same thing. So Cure Accelerator has 3 parts: discussions, funders asking for research, researchers asking for money. We beta launched. There's actually some of our users are here, and the public launch is June 1st. And so, thank you very much for listening. I didn't give any time for any questions, but I'm happy to take them when Nick tells me it's time.